Well, thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon for what I hope and think will be a fascinating session. I think the man to my left here, the speaker of the hour, doesn't really need much of an introduction, but I'll give him a very brief one. So Steve was born in Taiwan. I won't tell you which year. You can ask him later if you're interested. He moved to the United States when he was about 8 years old, moved to Illinois, and that's where he grew up. In 1999, as legend goes, he arrived in Silicon Valley and started working for, at that point, a relatively unknown and small digital payments company. It was a company that allowed for money transfer from one person to another, and that company was called PayPal. After spending a number of years at PayPal as one of their first engineers, Steve went on to a very short stint at Facebook. And then in 2005, he did what he is best known for, which is, with two other co-founders, Chad Hurley and Jawed Karim, founded YouTube. 1.5 years after YouTube was first founded, it sold to Google for, at that point, an astounding 1.6 billion US dollars, just a little over that. Since then, Steve, for a number of years, continued to lead the technology side of YouTube. And then a few years back, started working with Google Ventures. And now, after being a serial entrepreneur, a very successful one, he is an investor, he is an advisor, and as of quite recently, relocated back to Taiwan to work with the National Development Council there. So, Steve, welcome to Korea, welcome to the World Knowledge Forum. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to start with some personal questions, and I'll start with one that is maybe quite personal. I'm going to ask you about your childhood. I'm going to ask you to tell us something that is either interesting or defining about your childhood and how you grew up.
Sure. First, I was born in 1978. I think when YouTube sold when I was in my 20s, that was something that I tried to conceal. But at this point, passing 40, I'm happy to announce that. So I was born in Taiwan, and we moved to the U.S. in Chicago in the Midwest when I was 8 years old. And I think that one of the biggest changes that later was applied, I think, in sort of instilling this entrepreneurial spirit through junior high, high school, college, and ultimately out in Silicon Valley was, I think, not being able to completely immerse in the culture within the first few months of immigration. And then very quickly thereafter, being able to get a sense of what the differences and what the similarities between the cultures were, between the languages, between the families. And I think that that ultimately led me, my brother, to get a better sense of how to get a better sense of how people from various cultures interact and integrate together, and especially as you're talking about applications, web, internet, I think that's important to be able to get an understanding of how the users see the products.
So the outsider status, you feel like was an advantage in not only your childhood, but then in your entrepreneurial career.
I believe so, right. And I think you referred to this just a little bit. About a month and a half ago, I had just moved my entire family, and I have two sons, a 9-year-old and a 7-year-old. And I desperately wanted them to get a feeling of the world outside of the confinement of Silicon Valley, right? I think that they'd been there for I'd been there for 20 years. They're approximately there for 10 years. And so I think that moving them to Asia was something that I prominently did for the kids to be able to see sort of a similar experience from what I did when I moved to the U.S. when I was 8. We're bringing the kids back when they're close to 8.
That's fantastic. We'll come back to the move to Asia later on in the conversation. But I do want to ask that big move that you made in 1999 to Silicon Valley. What brought you to the Bay Area?
Right, so PayPal at the time was started by University of Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, the computer science program that I was enrolled in. And at the time in 1999, the staff there, the founders there, Chen was desperate to try to get engineers out there, and because of the connections that he had deeply with folks in sort of the Midwest, and specifically in the computer science department in Champaign-Urbana, he reached out to as many of the folks that he knew there. And I still remember this conversation that we had. It was done over an interview that was done over ICQ at the time. So that dates the conversation. It was just questions and answers.
It was a text interview over ICQ.
It was ICQ. And within 3 days, though, I really didn't know what truly to expect when I was going to get on that plane and move to Silicon Valley. And I still had sort of thoughts of what Silicon Valley really resembled. And within 3 days, though, it was down on the ground, working, checking in on a Saturday there at PayPal. And it also happened to be the first day that I met who eventually became the co-founder of PayPal, Chad Hurley.
Yeah. So, and Chad, and you were both engineers at PayPal?
Yeah, so Chad was more from the sort of the user interface design side, and I was more from the engineering side. And you know, throughout the course of the next 6 years, we worked closely together at PayPal before starting YouTube together. And I think had we not done that together, even with the idea of YouTube in 2005, it would have been difficult for us to build. There were so many, I think, hurdles that we had to overcome at PayPal. Sort of, there was the dot-com crash, there was the eventual the battle between eBay at the time, the eventual acquisition by eBay, how to run a company after a big acquisition. And so after going through that, I think we were all taking notes in our head about how to, if we were going to be on the other side of things. And who knew, just 4 or 5 years later, we would actually be facing those same problems ourselves.
So speaking of PayPal, before we move on to the origin story of YouTube, the PayPal mafia is a very real thing in global technology at this point. The early crew from PayPal, not only yourself, but of course, Max Chen, you have Elon Musk, you have, of course, Peter Thiel, and a number of others, have become the backbone of so many of Silicon Valley's great companies over the last 20 years. What made that group so special? Because since then, you've had other great Silicon Valley companies like Google and Facebook, and outside of Silicon Valley, you have the Spotifys of the world. And that mafia, that group, has never really been recreated by another company, that level of influence from a founding team. Why do you think that was?
You know, I think it's one of the very few companies that was able to fundraise well before 1999 and be able to survive past the dot-com crash, right? And it survived being able to just be creative all the time, every day, about the ways that we would solve problems and change the solutions that we had come up with when it was easy to fundraise versus when nobody was investing. And so I think that as a group, it worked well together. And when it started to, when we started creating new companies after that, there was a lot of collaboration, co-investments. Many of the engineers at YouTube all came from that original group at PayPal, and I think that because of that experience and time shared together, it was just a lot easier to be collaborating with other coworkers from PayPal.
It's a very special situation. I think every other Silicon Valley unicorn at this point is trying to replicate that. There are a lot of private Slack groups out there with startup name plus mafia after it for all the ex-employees trying to recreate what you guys were able to make possible. So let's move on to YouTube. Now, there are a couple of versions of the origin story of YouTube. There's one that I think have previously put on record saying that it initially started off as inspired to some degree by Hot or Not, and then it moved into the form that we now know it. And then there are other stories, one of which I really enjoy, which was that the Janet Jackson wardrobe malfunction at the 2004 Super Bowl. One of the founders wanted to look for that video online, couldn't find the video, so decided to build a product that would make searching for those kinds of videos easy. What is the true, in your opinion, Well, you were there, so this is truth. What is the true origin story of the ideas behind YouTube?
Right. So I think one of the first things as 20-year-olds starting a company is you end up hiring a PR agency to come in and more or less train about how to answer interview questions. And the first or second interview question was always, tell us the origin story of YouTube. And I just remember that whole evening spent with the PR agency was fabricating a story about how we started YouTube, about having dinners together, trying to share photos, trying to share videos, but there was no way to share the videos. And so we created YouTube. And it wasn't until the Viacom billion-dollar lawsuit where we had to legally tell the truth about how YouTube started, did the origin story, the true origin story, get out. And it really came down to partially, you're right, the inspiration by Hot or Not, but the fundamental idea was that you look at it and you have originally sharing text, sharing photos, sharing audio, sharing photos, and the next step there was just sharing videos. I think the idea of YouTube was always something that people had in their minds. There have been companies that have tried to do that prior to 2005. Google Video was also released in 2005. I think that the reason that YouTube succeeded was heavily dependent on the exact time that we started YouTube, exact time that we launched YouTube, right? There's a few things there that YouTube did that was different. You didn't have to download an application because for the first time videos could play inside the browser. You could upload a video from whether it's a Mac, whether it's a Linux machine, whether or not it's a Windows machine. And prior to that, you would get incompatibility errors. You would have to make downloads for the codecs. And so for the first time, YouTube was able to bypass that because everything was embedded in the browser. And it was still a time before the iPhone came out, but still all the digital cameras at the time were able to take videos for the first time. And so I think when all those combined together, it was only about the latter part of 2004, and we started YouTube in 2005, was it really possible to launch what we see as YouTube today?
There's a lot of talk right now in Silicon Valley about elevated valuations, about companies that raise a lot of money pre-product at this point, and a lot of concern that there is another bubble coming. Now, 2005, I think that past the first bubble burst in Silicon Valley, or at the very least the first modern bubble burst in Silicon Valley. 2005 was not exactly a frothy point in time in the Valley, and yet after pretty much only 18 months of operation, YouTube was acquired by Google for an astounding number, just a little over $1.6 billion worth of stock at that point. Walk us through that. How did that happen? And of course, it turned out that Google was a brilliant acquisition. There was obviously a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of second-guessing when Google made that acquisition back then, just the same way when people were freaked out that Amazon bought Twitch for $1 billion and so on and so forth. Tumblr bought by Yahoo, that didn't quite work out as well. But how did that process happen with Google? And how did it happen so quickly?
So by the time that we started talking, and I don't know if Jerry Yang is here because we first talked to Yahoo on Tuesday of the week, and we spoke with Yahoo about a potential acquisition. That the main rationale behind it wasn't so much the team couldn't continue to scale the product independently. The real reason was that we needed lawyers to defend what YouTube was doing. There's a lot of things as YouTube was starting to grow out of just the US market. It was starting to get into Japan, Germany. They were numbers 2, number 3, and it started actually just about the time that the acquisition happened. The majority of the content was coming from outside the US. And so that was one thing when you're inside the US to be defended by things like the Digital Millennium Copyrights Act, things that would defend a service like YouTube, but knowing that we were going to go international, we really needed the legal help and the scalability help that Google or Yahoo could provide. But there's a restaurant called Denny's in the U.S. It's a 24-hour restaurant. There was one that was right between the YouTube offices and the Google offices. It was also between the YouTube offices and the Yahoo offices. And for the reasons that we didn't want anybody to see us talking about this, for again, for legal reasons with a few music studios, we were not supposed to be talking about an acquisition. And so the place that we thought that we would not get recognized in the entire Bay Area was a 24-hour restaurant called Denny's. So that was on a Tuesday, and that was talking with Yahoo. And then fast forward, and this is some advice that I generally give to any companies that are under acquisition, that it's never enough just to talk to one potential acquirer. I at least talk to two. When it comes to funding, when it comes to acquisitions, talk to a few parties. And so on Thursday of that week, we met with Google. And so that was within a 48-hour period. And kind of an inside joke was that they were wanting to know where do we want to meet at, whether we meet at Google, whether we meet at YouTube. And we ended up saying that this is the table at the Denny's restaurant that we should meet at on Thursday.
Is there a plaque on that table in that Denny's?
Funny enough, 2 years later, Denny's actually asked us to go back and do a commercial and marketing for Denny's. And then there's other things where there was a fundraising event to go back to just that. There was an auction, and whoever won the auction was going to sit with us for breakfast at 8:30 a.m. at that exact table at Denny's. But when it comes to some of these figures, I mean, it's a little bit of a coin toss as to that 1.65 billion number. The original number came in as 1.5, and then you have a dinner with your board saying, we want more, but what do you say? And we were told that anything over 2 billion would be too much. They would withdraw the offer right away. So you go back and say, all right, how about 1.95? And then it came out to 1.65. And so the entire thing was compressed into 3 days. It was Friday, Saturday, Sunday, and then on the close of market on Monday afternoon was when we made the announcement that Google was acquiring YouTube.
It's hard to imagine that YouTube could be more successful and more impactful than it is today. Post-Google acquisition, with the nurturing and the investment, and of course the incredible talent that the YouTube team had, and then the influx of talent from Google. But if the lawyers had been available to you at that moment in time in 2006, and you got to do it over again, would you have sold?
No, I mean, I think that if you were to make comparisons to other companies that have started around that time, maybe Facebook is an example, I think that growth was a little bit slower. They weren't facing as many of the legal challenges that we were facing from around the world. So I do think that at that specific time in 2005 and 2006, there's no question that YouTube had to partner up with someone larger, someone with a more international presence. Frankly, I don't think that YouTube would still be around today if that acquisition with Google did not happen. I think that maybe if you fast forward by a few years, if you were to start a YouTube platform, a media platform today, with the changes and the evolution of how traditional media views the internet, views the user-generated content, having anything that you upload be automatically available without anybody proofreading, seeing this content, evaluating it, I think it would be a different story. But I think that during that 2005, 2006 era, this idea of user-generated content was so new to everybody that was involved, right? The content creators, the advertisers, marketers, and to the companies behind them, that it couldn't do it by itself.
Interesting, interesting. All right, so we've spent a bit of time, 20 minutes looking at the past. Let's move towards the future, which is what the panel is really about. So between 2005 and 2019, of course, over the course of the last 14 years, the state of media has changed significantly. The way that consumers discover content, the way that they consume it, the formats, the distribution rights, the distribution scale, the monetization, everything has changed. But of all those changes, are there a couple that you feel like are the most important and impactful differences between 2005 and today?
I think the one big change that with even YouTube itself, today, if I were asked as an entrepreneur from an investor, if they were to say, we would invest in you, maybe in Chad and the original engineers of YouTube to try to create a competitor to YouTube, there's no way I would take that check, right? I think that at this moment, there's such a dominant list of walled gardens between the Netflix of the world, the Disney, the ESPN, the Hulus, and the YouTubes and the Apples, 500, 600, 700 billion-dollar companies that are focusing all of their efforts to recruit, to bring in content, bring in exclusive content, and I think at this point, different from 2005, I believe that everything revolves around content creation and the content creators. And I think that in the last few years, if you've been able to show that you can create good content, and that's evident through a lot of the statistics that you would see anywhere on these sites, now is the best time to be that content creator.
So you mentioned the over-the-top services, which I also want to get to later on. And they're spending immense amounts of money creating new content, original content, high-quality production. I mean, Netflix is supposedly spending $12 billion on new content over the next 12 months. Is that, and then of course Disney's coming on board, Apple's doing the same thing, NBC's going to start their own streaming service, Hulu's already out there, not to mention all the other international players. Is that going to start drowning out the importance of user-generated content, of the stuff that made YouTube YouTube, the webcams in the bedrooms, now the smartphones on the streets? Is it going to make that content less important?
I think one of the first things that surprised us about YouTube, right, was the type of content that was being created. At first, we thought it was going to be more personal. It was going to be, you create a piece of content, you share it. Maybe it was from a birthday party. You share it, and you knew exactly where those 12 views come from. And originally, that was what we saw on YouTube. It was users they were creating content of events, and they were sharing it with the people that they wanted to, almost private videos. But there were a couple of videos. One of them was a Nike video that was created by Nike about Ronaldinho. There was a Saturday Night Live episode. And starting from these videos, we saw that there was content that was being created, and it was just for the world to see. And those were still professionally created content that was just uploaded to YouTube as a different platform to circulate this content. What we've seen develop and evolve in the last 8-9 years is the quality of user-generated content. And I think the evolution there is a lot faster. I think the evolution there is faster because there's a lot more cooperation, a lot more communication, the tools that are used out there, the advice out there. There's even videos about creating videos on YouTube, right? And so I think that, at this point, it's starting to blur the lines between what is user-generated content, which historically has been on one end of that spectrum, and professional content. And I think that you'll see music videos are still the most watched videos on YouTube. But in terms of subscriptions and subscribers, the top 10, many of them continue to be YouTube users creating original content in every country in the world.
I'm going to ask you to keep that UGC pioneer hat on for a minute here. Platforms like YouTube, how it fundamentally changed our ability to broadcast and distribute content as individuals is at this point under massive debate. Okay, how it actually has made the change and whether or not that change is good or bad. You just told us that the way that it's changed surprised you, not only in its speed of evolution, but also in the quality of evolution. You're right, that there is a massive blurring of the lines between the old webcam users and now what would be considered really, really high quality production, but not done by any production company, just by individuals. So with this democratization of content creation and distribution, do you see it still as a good thing for civil society, for debate and discourse? Or do you think that there's shadows of this evolution that we're not talking enough about yet?
Yeah, I mean, I think services like Facebook, like YouTube, specifically user-connected network services out there, with the ability to be able to upload a piece of video anywhere in the world and have it instantaneously be viewed from anywhere else in the world. And Facebook, the same thing. YouTube is a good example of this. It does highlight and elevate the problems that I think have always existed, but they're largely ignored because it didn't matter. I think fake news is one of the largest problems that have surfaced in the last few years, and YouTube is one of the most pointed examples as to the reason why fake news exists. And I think that it is a problem, right? I would certainly acknowledge that, and I think at the end of the day, I think the solution is going to come down to a combination of both technology and just further education. I think there are a few companies that are coming out of Silicon Valley now that are looking at ways to be able to, for example, do digital signatures of the creators, of the authors of this content, and being able to verify every step that it's gone along the way. I think that over a period of time, the traditional content creators, the traditional news outlets will resurface as the more reliable sources to be able to get this content. So I think we're in the thick of it. I think that nobody really expected when we started YouTube, we didn't think that fake news was going to be an issue. I think that that's really surfaced in the last few years, and I think it's going to be a combination of user education and technology that's going to solve that.
I do want to also clarify for the audience here, Steve has not been an operating leader at YouTube for a number of years now. He's an observer like the rest of us. So do take this as a comment coming from the founder of YouTube, a keen observer of the media industry in the future, not a comment directly from YouTube. And it's important to clarify because as a news publisher, if YouTube came out and said, yeah, man, we have accountability, that would be front page news tomorrow.
I think there are a lot of things under interview training that I couldn't say if I was still wearing a Google badge. Yeah. So I can be a lot more honest today than I would have been a few years ago.
I do want to get to the new stuff because not only are you increasingly an advocate of the news industry, but you are an active investor in the news industry in a really, really interesting company, which I will get to. But before that, as a segue to news, newsrooms right now, you did mention fake news and misinformation. Newsrooms are now spending an inordinate amount of resources to combat and to disprove misinformation. And video is one of those areas where it's increasingly difficult. And we are, as a news industry, deathly afraid of what's coming, which is deepfakes. And I know that deepfakes can by itself be another hour-long panel, if not longer. But the reality is that by most people's assessments in the industry, within 6 months, we're going to have deepfakes that are going to be really, really hard to parse from reality. Where's the accountability? What is the solution? Maybe you already answered the question, but what is the solution that needs to be created, that needs to be deployed to make sure that newsrooms don't spend all of their resources trying to disprove a video to say, oh, this is, this celebrity, this politician, this academic never said this thing?
No, I mean, frankly, I mean, the simple answer is I don't know exactly what that solution is. I think that there are, it's widely viewed as, from an entrepreneurial standpoint, from a technology standpoint, that it's something that technology can assist in. There's a lot of aspects of crypto keys, digitally signing to make sure and authenticate every step along the way, and to make sure that this piece of content is really from this source, and from this source to YouTube or whatever services that you're viewing this, nothing has changed. But even if that were the case, I think that there still needs to be a lot more user education these days. I think that it's not, since the 1960s to maybe 10 years ago, you turn on the TV, there are only 7 channels that you watch, and it's all 7 of those channels they've gone through professional editing, they've gone through the amount of effort that goes into creating and distributing that content versus being able to upload something instantaneously, I think brings a lot of questions up. And so I think that, but I do think that many of these questions, many of these challenges have always existed. It's just now it's just compressed because of the internet.
To the credit, I think, of the internet population of users, deepfakes is the first new technology and innovation in quite some time that I've seen at deployment users have rallied against. Right? That users have said, this is not only creepy, this is wrong. And even though people are obviously playing with it, there are hordes of people on the internet, let's call it the democratic population of the internet, rising up to say, this ought not to be a thing. As an example, there was an app in China recently that became one of the fastest downloaded apps, or the most popular apps within days of launch, that allowed people to use deepfake technology and place faces onto movie scenes or TV scenes. And it immediately took off, but immediately became problematic, and something ended up being done about it because the zeitgeist, the internet armies of China rose up and said, this is not okay. So I do wonder if that kind of consumer pushback is going to continue, and maybe that will hold at bay the deployment of deepfake at so much scale that it's going to really hurt our ability to understand truth from falsehood.
No, I agree. I mean, I think that that this is a problem, and I think even as just a parent of kids, right? I mean, I think that there's a lot of aspects of it that I can give them in terms of the technology to be able to contain this. But I think a large part is educating and education of these kids that of something that just didn't exist when we were growing up.
The 2 top questions here from the crowd are both about YouTube, and they're good ones. So let me go through both of them. The first one here, what Google values have changed YouTube into what it is now from what you have founded? And I think this is an interesting question because YouTube remained relatively separate for a number of years. And the integration, frankly, for those of us who rely on YouTube, especially in the news industry, came, in our opinions, way late, too late.
Right.
So YouTube had its own culture, had its own teams. But in your opinion, what Google values have changed YouTube for the better or for the worse?
Yeah, so I mean, I think with any acquisition, it's difficult to know what that day after the acquisition is finalized and the signatures are out, what exactly that's going to be. I think promises can be made before, but you really don't know until after the acquisition is complete. And bringing back the point where we had gone through the acquisition with eBay purchasing PayPal, and the 30 plus engineers at YouTube had all gone through that experience. And one of the first things that eBay did after the acquisition of PayPal was to let the Peter Thiels and the Max Levchins and the Elon Musks go. And essentially what that means is that it would remove the sort of executive layer, and it would put in the eBay team in command, and it would put the eBay team structuring the future of what PayPal was doing to be aligned with what eBay wanted, rather than having it continue out with what PayPal was doing. I think that that was from that experience, the biggest question with that acquisition was whether or not Google was going to do the same thing as YouTube. And if you look now, YouTube is still completely separate. It's a separate office from Google. The teams are still completely separated. The executive team at the time, or even just after the acquisition, they still let us make the executive decisions of what YouTube was doing, and what they just did was asked us the resources that we needed that was provided by Google, and asked us to use that to whatever we wanted for YouTube itself. And so I think that for looking back, I think that there's no question that we needed to make that decision to sell. And I have to say that the acquisition by Google has turned out to be a very good one for both YouTube as a company, and then more importantly, I think for the users.
Excellent. The other YouTube question, also a good one. What is the next innovation? The next great innovation for YouTube? There's been a lot of experimentation and new live features and VR features in YouTube. What is the next big thing for YouTube?
You know, I do think that I think we are coming into this era where we're starting to see, I think, YouTube, when it was first launched, there was no other place to be able to upload your videos. YouTube was the only place to upload your videos, and for many years, that it was the dominant player. I think that in just the last 18 months, we've seen the announcement from Apple, from Netflix, from Amazon, to be able to create their own versions of places that you're going to be able to access this content. I think it'll be interesting as we start seeing the separation again from a single content source of YouTube distributing to now distributing again to multiple places that you're going to be able to access this content. So I think that I don't know exactly what the picture will be, but I do think that it's going to be interesting to see how this plays out with that competition.
Since we are in Seoul, I think it's worthwhile to ask you your thoughts on the Korea platforms, because, and this is a question also from Slido, there are a couple of Korean platforms that truly dominate, that within this marketplace, they are not only the incumbent, they are the 800-pound gorilla in the room. What stands out to you about the Korean platforms?
You know, and this is not just with videos, but with chat, with everything, with payments. I do think that Korea has shown to the rest of the world what will be happening to the rest of the world in its internet and its innovations in the next few years, right? And so, my wife, she's Korean, and still the apps on her phone are completely different from the apps that I use on my phone. They're performing the same services, but in many ways they're more advanced than what I'm using. I think the difficulty in Taiwan, but also in Korea, is to be able to expand beyond the boundaries of Korea. I think many of the technologies in Korea are better than what we see in the rest of the world, in Silicon Valley itself. However, to be able to take that and to be able to distribute that and internationalize that, that's something that maybe you need a Google acquisition to do.
Even that may not necessarily work. We've seen that in other places around the world as well. But I would agree with you that the Korean ecosystem and the app ecosystem, technology ecosystem is incredibly impressive, and there's plenty that the rest of the world should learn. With our remaining 2 minutes or so, I want to ask you a big question. You can answer however you want. Can you make a prediction for the future that will surprise most of the people in this room?
That's a good question.
You wish I'd prepped you on this, right?
Let's see. I think what has been the most interesting for me is looking at, just in general with AI, machine learning. And I do think that we're going to see some some incredible innovations coming out of Silicon Valley, but I think one of the bigger changes that we're going to see is going to be more collaboration between between different companies, different countries, and specifically, I think, between the politicians and technology and the entrepreneurs. Frankly, I think that's, if I were to name one thing that's going to change that seesaw balance between innovative products coming out of China versus coming out of the US, it's the collaboration between the entrepreneurs and the government. And so I think that with all the trips back into Silicon Valley, the entrepreneurs there and the engineers are there, but I really think that there needs to be a more cohesive cooperation, right, between the government and these entrepreneurs.
I think that would certainly be surprising if it does happen that way, certainly in the short term, but it would be for the betterment of the world, as we've talked about. Ladies and gentlemen, can you please join me in giving Steve Chen a huge thank you for coming here and sharing his thoughts about so many different things. Thank you so much, Steve.
Thank you. That's good. Thank you.